what I want to do today is provide a bit of context for what you've read of mine, at least today. First, the context for red skin, white mass is that it really did come out of a PhD thesis. So it's necessarily limited in scope. And it was a part of a personal decolonization. So overcoming the subjective conditions within this material context required that I work on some of this stuff, and to do so, it was like a going home for me, which emphasizes the location of culture, the specificity of land, and then extrapolating out in terms of a national politics out of it. And as you'll see, the focus on the land-based aspect or the place-based aspect necessarily kind of cut off from broader communities, of which were really informative of that period of organizing. And the second is the once were Maoists. So this is coming from a book that I'm writing, which serves as a prequel to the first book, which looks at the international dimensions of land-based politics, its overlap with the Black radical tradition and third world struggles, and that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. I also just want to bring up the fact that I have been suffering a tiny bit from anxiety. It's this Zoom that drives me absolutely nuts. So if I'm a little bit skittish, that's why. So I'm just going to jump into it with hopefully some time for questions afterwards. So the Indigenous nations, and this is the BC part, so the part that the foregrounding of the internationalism, I guess, would be the word that informed NARP's organizing in the 1960s and 70s. Indigenous nations and now what is known as British Columbia, Canada, have a rich history of domestic and international activism. While it's beyond the scope of this presentation to delve into this history in detail, it is important to note that one of the core determinants of this activism has been the refusal of the BC government to satisfactorily resolve the Indian land question in the province. Unlike many other regions in Canada, there are very few historic treaties signed between Indigenous nations and the Crown in British Columbia, save the Douglas Treaties on Vancouver Island and Treaty 8 in the northeastern corner of the province. From the perspective of the federal government, the purpose of signing historical treaties with Indigenous nations was to secure state sovereignty over what were previously the self-governed territories of Indigenous nations through a process which it is called extinguishment. Extinguishment was thought to be the most expedient way to eliminate Indigenous land title for the twin purposes of colonial settlement and capitalist development on Indigenous land. In most of BC and places across Northern Canada, these mechanisms of legalized land divestment were never implemented, thus leaving a black hole of economic uncertainty over the unceded territories in question. Who owns the land in such circumstances? What are the rules that guide settlement and economic development in these places? Developers tend to like answers to these questions before they invest too heavily in infrastructure and extraction projects, especially in liberal democracies like Canada, so that Indigenous communities have no legal recourse when they disrupt profit margins by blocking flows of resource capital hemorrhaging from their traditional territories. Now, treaties, of course, hold a radically different meaning for Indigenous peoples, even for those communities that never entered into negotiations over them. Generally speaking, most of the historic treaties signed between First Nations and the Crown described exchanges where First Nations agreed to share some of their lands in exchange for payments and promises made by officials representing the Crown. They're often understood as sacred commitments to maintain a relationship of reciprocity, which respects the way of life and relative autonomy of each partner over time. As such, treaties are agreements that affirm rights and title, not extinguish them. Seen in this light, treaties provide an international framework for ensuring nation-to-nation relationships between Indigenous peoples in Canada, and Indigenous peoples have defended them as such. Without an acceptable mechanism in place to secure the rights and title, the default position of First Nations in the province has been that the land remains theirs and still falls under their jurisdiction. Over the last century, BC First Nations have defended this stance, legally and politically, through a number of venues, including the sending of formal petitions and or delegations to Victoria, Ottawa, and London to defend their case. For the Nisga'a, for example, of northwestern British Columbia, their formal legal claims date back to at least the 1887 meeting with the provincial premier and the subsequent formation of the first Nisga'a Land Committee 3 years later. Their efforts resulted in a petition to the Privy Council of England, which set out the demands of the Nisga'a that would prevail over the next 100 years. Accompanying the position was the following declaration, unanimously adopted by the Nisga'a Nation on January 22nd, 1913. And I quote, "We are not opposed to the coming of white people to our territory, provided this be carried out justly in accordance with the British principles embodied in the Royal Proclamation. If therefore, as we expect, the Aboriginal rights which we claim shall be established by the decision of His Majesty's Privy Council, we would be prepared to take a moderate and reasonable position. In that event, claiming the right to decide for ourselves the terms upon which we would deal with our territory, we would be willing that all matter outstanding between the province and ourselves be finally adjusted with some equitable method to be agreed upon, which would include representation of the Indian tribes upon the commission, upon any commission that might be appointed." In 1913, the Nisga'a Land Committee joined forces with two other early pan-Indigenous organizations in BC, the Indian Rights Association and the Interior Tribes of British Columbia, to form a unified front in the Allied Tribes of British Columbia. As Indigenous historian Sarah Nichol notes, this new organization allowed the Nisga'a, the Interior Salish, and Southern nations to pursue land claims as a cohesive political force rather than as isolated groups. 7 years prior, in 1906, Squamish chief Joe Capilano, along with two other community delegates, took their political grievances directly to King Edward in London. Although their trip was unsuccessful, with the British Crown insisting that the delegation's concerns regarding land title was strictly a domestic affair, the trip demonstrates the persistence of First Nations political organization and organizing over the last century, and also hints at the international character of such efforts. What is also clear from these examples is that the federal government would soon make sure that these types of claims against the state would not happen without punitive consequence. To this end, in 1927, the federal government made it illegal via amendments to its already racist and sexist Indian Act of 1876 to formally organize for political purposes or to solicit legal representation or to raise money to do so, to pursue claims against the state, thus undermining to a significant degree the foundation of Indigenous organizing during this period. While the 1927 amendment to the Indian Act outlawed Indigenous legal and political activism, had the expected consequence of significantly curtailing this work. It effectively destroyed the Allied Tribes of British Columbia, for instance. It didn't stamp it out entirely. First Nations continued to press their concerns through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, although often concealed under different guises, via organizations like the Indian Brotherhood of British Columbia, a First Nations fishing organization established in 1931, the aforementioned Nisga'a Land Committee, which managed to carry out its work in a truncated manner, and a variety of BC Native women's homemaker clubs, which would eventually amalgamate in the formation of the British Columbia Indian Homemakers Society and the BC Native Women's Society in 1968. In terms of the latter organizations, Indigenous women were able to effectively use patriarchal assumptions of the day regarding the domestic and apolitical nature of Native women's labor in the home to discuss, formulate, and pursue their individual and collective political interests under the radar of an increasingly repressive state apparatus. The politics of Indigenous labor organizing in the early 20th century is also worth noting here for similar reasons. As the work of historian Andy Barnaby demonstrates, this history has a long lineage of native radical internationalism, especially on the shores of Bernard Inlet, North Vancouver, where Squamish longshoremen not only dominated lumber-related work on the docks, but were also pioneers of industrial unionism there. Essentially, the seasonal wage labor offered by working the lumber on the waterfront served as a temporary buffer of the Squamish Nation, as two distinct and asymmetrical modes of production were starting to come into violent contact with each other. Industrial capitalism on the one hand, and the subsistence economy of the Squamish Coast Salish on the other. Squamish men and women were important, if unequal, actors in this industrial context, writes Barnaby, that all the occupational pursuits undertaken by Aboriginal workers were seasonal is important, he continues, as it hints at the ways in which the temporal and spatial rhythms of a customary, kin-ordered way of life articulated with the logic of a burgeoning capitalist labor market, end quote. At a time when it was becoming increasingly difficult to organize as Indigenous people, doing so as workers allowed Squamish men and women to selectively deploy their labor power through the seasonal wage to protect that which was most important to them. Access to a life on the land and waters determined by customary law and tradition, and not those dictated solely by the demands of colonial capital. Protecting this fragile articulation of these modes of production by defending seasonal wage work became the focus of early Indigenous union activity on the coast. To my mind, the most fascinating union at the time to do so was Local 526 of the Industrial Workers of the World, established in 1906 by primarily Squamish log handlers. The local, formed a year after the Wobblies did in Chicago itself, became fondly known by its approximately 50 to 60 Indigenous members as the Bows and Arrows chapter. As far as defending the type of people and labor in question, the IWW was a natural choice, given its progressive racial politics for the time, as well as its reputation for serving workers who did not did not fit well into established craft union structures, the unskilled, the migratory, and the marginal. While the local only lasted 2 years, many of the Squamish workers involved in the Bows and Arrows went on to form the again largely Indigenous Local 3857 of the International Longshoremen Association. The ILA through 3857, it turned out, would emerge as a launching pad for the next generation of Indigenous rights activists in the province, of which the most prominent was Squamish Chief Andy Paul. Paul emerged out of his union days as a tireless native rights activist, fighting for the betterment of Indigenous people, lands, and communities in BC, Canada, and the United States through organizations like the previously mentioned Allied Tribes of British Columbia, of which he was a founding member. And then after the latter's demise, the North American Indian Brotherhood, which he co-founded in 1944. During his tenure as president of the NIAB, Paul would serve as a friend and mentor to another emerging Indigenous political force in the province, Secwepemc leader George Manuel. Manuel would take over the presidency of the NAIB following the death of his mentor in 1959, and serve in this capacity until 1963, after which he moved on to serve in numerous other critically important provincial, national, and international political organizations, including as chief of the National Indian Brotherhood between 1971 and 1976, the president of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs between 1979 and 1981, and the founder of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples between 1975 and 1981. Manuel's foundational 1974 book, The Fourth World, An Indian Reality, details his life of Indigenous activism during this period. Republished in 2000, I forget, a couple of years ago now anyway, for the first time since 1974, The Fourth World is unquestionably one of the core texts in the wave of Native literature that moved out of the tumultuous politics of the global 1960s and 70s. The text lays out, to my mind, the political and cultural foundation of Indigenous resistance to colonial domination over the last 4 centuries. He argues that the colonization set in motion a Manichaean struggle between the colonizer and Indigenous peoples, propelled by 2 fundamentally incommensurable ideas of land. Land as a commodity, something that can be, quote, speculated, bought, sold, mortgaged, claimed by one state, surrendered, and counterclaimed by another, and land as a relationship. Land is our Mother Earth. Indigenous peoples' struggles to defend the latter against the violent globalization of the former is at its core of what Manuel calls the struggles of the Fourth World. Now, the Fourth World thus acts simultaneously as a noun and a verb. As a verb, it's referred to a process or movement of decolonization grounded in a purposeful revitalization of those relational, land-informed Indigenous practices and modes of life that settler colonization sought to destroy in its efforts to transform Indigenous peoples' lands into settler state and capital. The Fourth World thus shares similarities with Prashad's definition of the Third World and the darker nations. It describes an oppositional politics positioned against the violence of colonialism and imperialism that evades cultural essentialism while remaining attentive to and informed by diverse cultural and material contexts. The Third World is not a thing, but a project. If you fought against it and stood against imperialism, then you were part of the Third World, writes Prashad. Yet at the same time, Manuel's Fourth World also references a diverse and dispersed, geographical recognizably demographic. We are the Fourth World, a forgotten world, the world of Aboriginal peoples locked into independent states, but without adequate voice in the decisions that we make or that are made that affect our lives. If the appeal of Third World politics to the North American New Left had to do with its opposition to racism and colonialism, as much as the Old Left's disdain for economic exploitation and inequality, then the Fourth World concept sought to widen the spectrum of analysis even further, to include those people formerly excluded from the decolonization movements that gained international legal traction in the wake of the Second World War, particularly following the UN's Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial and Colonized Peoples in 1960. The problem with this significant moment in the development of international law is that it was institutionalized in a way that purposefully excluded recourse for Indigenous peoples colonized by states that came to incorporate their previously self-governing nations within the territorial jurisdictions claimed by the colonial states themselves. This became known as the blue or saltwater thesis, which arbitrarily restricts the right of self-determination to overseas colonies. Politically, the Fourth World developed and deepened through Manuel's extensive international travel and advocacy work, of which a 1971 trip to Tanzania was very important. Manuel traveled to Tanzania as part of a small delegation of Canadian diplomats who were invited to attend the commemoration of Tanzania's 10th year of independence. Jean Chrétien, who was then Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, was originally supposed to lead the small delegation, but had to cancel his participation at the last minute. As a result, Manuel was greeted by local politicians as Canada's lead representative. The elite access that this very unorthodox situation provided Manuel with an opportunity to engage in one-on-one conversation with key governmental ministers, including President Julius Nyerere himself, about their respective colonial experiences and what a genuinely post-colonial form of economic, social, and cultural development might look like, one that refused to take its cues from mimicking European models. Indeed, Tanzania's 1969 Arusha Declaration outlined what was to be a culturally informed model of socialist, political, and economic development called the Jama, or familyhood in Kiswahili, which was to draw off of the communal social relations of traditional African societies in building the post-colonial state and economy. Now, while the first few years of Tanzania's independence were shaped by economic and social policies inherited from British colonialism, from the Arusha Declaration in 1970 or until 1974, Tanzania had established itself as a veritable epicenter, to use Seth Markle's words, for freedom fighters, non-aligned movement militants, US Black nationalists, Marxist intellectuals, and Pan-Africanists. all intrigued by the anti-colonial and socialist political stance offered by Nyerere and Tanzania's single political party, TANU. Socialism, democracy, unity, and self-reliance, and peasant empowerment at home, Pan-African and Third World solidarity above, or abroad, sorry. It is in this global context that I first came across the work of Manuel as an undergraduate student in 1998 at the University of Alberta. I was researching a term paper on the Dene Declaration in 1975 and found myself repeatedly stumbling across references to the relationship between the third and fourth worlds in general, as well as to the significance of Tanzania in particular. I'd like you to consider the example taken from from an early draft of the Declaration, or the Dene Declaration of 1975. It states unequivocally that there are, quote, many lessons for the Dene to learn from the development of the third world countries. As colonies of imperial powers, they everywhere failed to develop. Their prospects necessarily improved to the extent that they were successful in gaining independence. But even after formal political independence, they may have had trouble developing because of the power of the so-called multinational corporations, with their base in a small number of highly developed industrial societies, and has denied their genuine economic independence. Only with tremendous effort can people and an economy develop independent from outside control. Our situation in the North is like that of the peoples of the third world, who until very recently were subjugated. As Aboriginal peoples within a white society, we are part of what we are calling the fourth world. Now, the draft declaration ends with several appendices, including one outlining a declaration on development, which proposed an alternative mixed economy, privileging a contemporary bush mode of production articulated with industrial activity. Where this industrial activity, the democratization of production and economic distribution through worker-owned and operated enterprise was advanced. This economic vision would be realized by subsidizing a mode of production based on the combination of continued renewable resource activities, such as hunting, fishing, and trapping, as well as community scale activities designed to meet our needs in a more self-reliant fashion. The inspiration, at least in part, for this Dene model of socialist development, again, Tanzania. And I quote, "What other people might call development is not necessarily development for Indian people. Only Dene people can say what development means for the Dene nation. For example, many people that say that the Mackenzie Valley pipeline is development, but this is not true development for the Dene people. The pipeline may not only damage our land, it might destroy our way of life as a nation. True development can only strengthen our nation and our way of life." The people of the African country of Tanzania were, like the Dene people, also invaded by a white colonial government. Today they are independent and they're saying this about development. Any action which does not increase a people's say in determining their affairs or running the rest of their lives is not development and holds them down, even if the action brings them a little bit better health and a little bit more bread. In other words, we cannot call development any activity which takes away control from our people. True development must give us more control and greater independence. Now, I suspect that the influence of Tanzania came at least at its outset through the Dene Nation's relationship with Manuel at the time. Characteristic of his leadership and political work more generally, Manuel was a strong supporter of the Dene Nation's land struggle and worked in his capacity as the national Indian chief to promote our bid for self-determination. When the Dene Declaration was published in 1975, the predominant response was negative. As I discussed in Redskin White Mask, then Minister of Indian Affairs Judge Buchanan dismissed the Dene Declaration as gobbledygook that a grade 10 student could have written in 15 minutes. Even respected Cree leader and dear friend of Manuel, Harold Cardinal, condemned the declaration as, quote, intrusion of left-wing thinking that is perhaps much closer to the academic community in Toronto than it is to the Dene. Now, much of the criticism leveled at the Dene Nation during this period expressed a similar sentiment. The Dene leadership had been manipulated by the theoretical and practical influence of outside agitators and were therefore not acting in the interests of our own people. This assumption extended to the writing of the declaration itself. which at the time was believed by many non-natives to be drafted by one of the Dene Nation's white consultants, some guy named Peter Puxley, based on his adaptation of Tanzania's Arusha Declaration. The thrust of the argument here again being that these cross-fertilizations could not have been grounded in Dene value and interests, but had to come from the ideological influences from the outside. Dene activist Gina Blondin strikes to the core of such claims. To someone with a frame of mind like this, all Aboriginal peoples are less human and easily controlled by expert advisors. Such a position, she claims, is paternalistic, racist, inhumane, and completely without any basis. But what about the rumors insisting that the Dene Declaration was modeled after the Arusha Declaration? I would suggest that this claim has more merit. As suggested in a 1975 correspondence between the sub-office of the Indians of Quebec Association, represented at the time by George Manuel's son, the late Arthur Manuel, and then Vice President of the Dene Nation, Richard Nyirasu, detailed plans were in the works to send Dene field workers to Tanzania to, quote, learn from their experience in development for a period of 2 to 3 months. The letter was included as an information package compiled by a 1977 Northwest Territories General Legislative Assembly to generate public concern over the supposed communist nature of the Dene self-determination movement. Also included in the package was a list of reading materials that the then Dene Nation Community Development Program Director, George Erasmus, suggested might be used in constructing a, quote, development philosophy for the Dene Nation. The list of readings included, among others, Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Memi's Colonizer and the Colonized, and Regis Debray's Revolution and the Revolution. Also included in the materials were books on Tanzania specifically, including Nyeri's collection of speeches, Freedom and Socialism, Freedom and Unity, Nyeri on Socialism, and Ajama, Essays on Socialism. According to Erasmus, these, quote, alternative sources on development were meant to supplement but not replace research and perspectives drawn from the land-based knowledge of community members. Quote, many alternatives must be looked at, wrote Erasmus in a letter addressed to the field workers, especially the example from our cultures, the approach to development and distribution of material ownership that our forefathers took. We may wish to keep some of the aspects of the old way in this industrial era. Manuel's international travels would eventually culminate in the historic 1975 founding of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples in Port Alberni, British Columbia, which hosted Indigenous participants from 19 different countries across 4 different continents. The WCIP would go on to champion the rights of Indigenous peoples across the planet, with its advocacy work serving as instrumental to the eventual development of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982 and the UN Declaration on the Rights in 2007. That is, this is all to say that by the time we reached the birth of Red Power in the late 1960s, Indigenous men and women in BC had already established themselves as skilled organizers, defending their land and sovereignty in both national and international forums for decades. It was this long history of expansive pan-Indigenous activism in BC and beyond that ultimately contributed to the 1951 repeal of the federal government of many of its repressive legislation, including the parts of the act that prohibited political organization. These subsequent legislative appeals had a ramping up effect in terms of Indigenous people's ability to effectively mobilize. Put simply, the repeals decriminalized Native people's legal advocacy and political work, which brought this work above ground and, for better or worse, into the mainstream. This in turn created a legitimate organizational infrastructure that spanned across the whole of Indian country, an infrastructure that First Nations were able to tap into and help fuel the pan-Indigenous response to the federal government's next assimilative initiative, the 1969 White Paper. And it was this legitimate political force that the state, or the illegitimate political force that encompassed NARP, was responding to.